Oh, good.
I'm sharing. All right.
Oh, beautiful.
There we go. And I believe we are live.
All right.
On a little bit of a delay, but that's okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, I'm going to share that. Okay, cool. Beautiful.
All right. So Glenn, I am ready when you are.
Okay, cool. I am going to share that as well. Okay, cool.
All right.
And wait, let me get off that so it's not a feedback loop. And we're gonna go. Okay, cool. Here we go. All right, friends.
Perfect.
So happy Pride. My name's Glenn. I'm a musical theater actor from New York City, tour guide. You may have seen me on the show Camp Getaway. And I'm excited to share with you some of the history of the West Village and Stonewall. And then this is my lovely co-host, Sarah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah. I am also a New York City tour guide. I also run a cabaret in New York City, or I would if people would stay indoors long enough for us to make the virus go away, but I digress. But I'm a lifelong New Yorker, out and proud, and I think that my favorite tour of all the ones that I've given is this one that you're about to get virtually. Especially because it means I get to hang out with Glenn and we get to do it together.
Yes, my favorite co-host.
Yeah, so obviously we're not doing this in our usual setting, walking around the village together. But when we do that, it gives me an opportunity. Part of what I love so much about this is that it gives me an opportunity to walk everybody through my uncle's history as well as LGBT history in general in the village. So you might hear me bring him up a couple times throughout the tour. His name is James Lyons, although sometimes professionally he went by Jim. And if you've ever seen Postcards from America or Velvet Goldmine or Virgin Suicides, that was him. He did those things. Todd Haynes always made jokes about him being the one that got away. And I don't know how truthful that is. I have no idea. Todd, let me know, catch me up. But it's really exciting for me not only to be able to share this history, but also to share it with Glenn.
Yes.
He's wonderful and amazing. And he kind of sped through the name of his show. So I'm going to say it louder and longer. Camp Getaway. If you haven't seen it yet, you should do it. But we are here today to show you LGBT NYC, a primer. Now, most of what we're going to be doing today is part of our usual tour, but if you're tuning in and you're a repeat visitor, there are some sites that we don't give on our usual tour because we can do that. That I can't wait to show you about as well. But Glenn, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we kick in?
No, let's celebrate the anniversary of the Stonewall riots with giving you a little more information about it.
Yes, happy Pride!
Happy Pride!
Also, quick for everyone who's on the Zoom, if at any point you're in full screen and you want to move our faces around to make it easier to see the images on the screen, you can just click and drag the icons that you see with our videos in them wherever you want to put them is okay with us. Quick tech update. Also, anybody who has any questions about anything, you can drop them in the comment section of anywhere where we're streaming, including on the Zoom. Glenn will be watching those comments while I run the PowerPoint. But now we're into content.
Yeah. So before we start, I think it's important to understand the historical context, sort of the atmosphere of what it was like to be an LGBT person in the 60s and 70s. Or 50s and 60s, rather. So if you were an LGBT person, you lived in the shadows. Coming out often meant losing your job, losing your friends. And so they lived in the shadows. Gay men would often meet in public restrooms, and there was sort of a code. There was a way to find other people who you knew were also gay. But even those situations were were tough because often policemen would go into those situations because it was actually illegal to have public displays of affection between same-sex couples. So a handhold, a kiss, something more than that could get you arrested. So that's sort of the atmosphere. We are also simultaneously in the civil rights movement. So there's an energy of progress, of change, of rebellion in America at this time. And I think that energy seeped into and sort of influenced the LGBT liberation movement, which happened a little bit afterwards. So that's sort of the energy that's going on now. Now, what would happen is if you wanted to go to a gay bar, they had to also run in secret. So the Stonewall Inn was one such gay bar. It was actually run by the mafia. That was how they were able to keep the police at bay. So they would pay bribes to the police so that they would know when a raid would happen. So the police would come in a typical raid, the police would line up the patrons, and then a police person would take a patron into the bathroom to check and see if they were dressed in the appropriate clothing, the same clothing as their assigned at birth gender. Basically, if you were a transgender person or if you were a drag queen, you would be arrested just for dressing in a different gender expression than the one you were assigned at birth. So now typically they would know when these raids would happen. So patrons, it would be on kind of a slow night. They would know what happens. They'd kind of stay away. But for whatever reason, that wasn't the case in the early morning of June 28th, 1969. A group of policemen came into the bar, told all the patrons to line up, and for the first time, they said no. Now, I also want to sort of paint the picture of who was in attendance this night. So it was mostly queer people of color. It was trans women of color. And they had been used to dealing with the police their entire lives. They'd been harassed by police up in Harlem their entire existence. These are sex workers. These are people that don't have, as a queer person and a person of color, they had it so hard. And at this point, they had nothing left to lose. They were ready to deal with the police. And for the first time, they stood up and said, no, we're not going to listen to you. We're not going to abide by these disgusting tactics. And we're going to stand up for ourselves. So it actually caused so much commotion that the police were barricaded into the Stonewall Inn. It caused commotion outside. People came in. They were trying to arrest people, take them away in the pedicabs. And they finally stood up and said no. These riots lasted for about 5 days. These violent rebellion against police brutality. Sound familiar, friends? So it is those riots that were commemorated a year later in 1970, the gay liberation movement. It was a parade that commemorated the Stonewall riots, and that is considered to be the very first Pride Parade. And that is what we celebrate every single year. We would be nothing without the queer people of color who started it all. So yeah, that is Stonewall. So now we're going to be continuing along and hearing about some of the other protests that happened in the area.
Yeah, we are. But first, you don't have to take our word for it.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. You don't have to take our word for it. We are lucky enough that substantial video was taken of the people who were the biggest movers and shakers in the movement post Stonewall. There's a lot of debate about who threw the first brick, things like that. You might have heard the name Marsha P Johnson before, who was a major activist in the community. She did not throw the first brick, but she was there and she was important. She showed up like around 2. She was wearing a disco ball in true Marsha fashion, but she did also show up at the first Pride Parade, that rally.
Hey, what do you say? Pass the bill or you'll pay.
Why are you here today?
Darling, I want my gay rights now. I think it's about time the gay brothers and sisters got their rights. And especially the women.
How will this affect you and your job?
Darling, I don't have a job. I'm on welfare. I have no intention of getting a job as long as this country discriminates against homosexuals. There's only homosexuals, bisexuals, bisexuals and trisexuals, darling, and he has no straight people. Because it is trying out women, honey.
Thank you very much for talking.
So yeah, she was amazing. Absolutely amazing. And even when she wasn't marching, she had something amazing to say.
You can count your karma if Nirvana is your goal. You can shake and you can rattle. You can rock and roll. You can be a Clark Kent or a Lois or an Alice down a hole. You can be a vampire on a mountain with a heart of stone black coal. You can be a leather angel on a sleek black Harley bike, or a redhead screaming faggot, or a dazzling giant. You can lock yourself in a closet in a fine meat stove, but it really doesn't matter if you ain't got soul.
Reach. Oh, God. But now, Marsha's longtime partner in advocacy was Sylvia Rivera, who was at that rally that she was talking about being on welfare and fighting for our rights. And this is just to show you that just like today, back then, these trans women of color, mostly homeless, a fair number of them sex workers, were not as respected within the movement that they started as they should have been. So this is Sylvia taking the stage at the Washington Monument to explain why it's so important that she is there and why people like her are represented in the movement.
I believe in the gay power. I believe in us getting our rights, or else I would not be out there fighting for our rights. That's all I wanted to say to your people. Come and see the people at Storehouse on 12th Street. The people that are trying to do something for all of us, and not men and women that belong to a white middle class club. And that's what you all belong to. Revolution now!
So yeah.
What's so heart-wrenching about that video is Sylvia and Marsha, as transgender women, were fighting for the rights of gays and lesbians and everyone else in their community, but they were so often ridiculed and reviled by our own community. And you can hear it in that video, the crowd reacting negatively against her, and it's just so sad. I think we still are dealing with the echoes of that, but incredible. They were willing to fight for us. We weren't willing to fight for them yet.
Yeah. And later on in that documentary, she says that if Marsha hadn't come home to the apartment that night, if she'd been out working on the streets because she was a sex worker, and she hadn't come home that night, she might have come home in the morning to Sylvia not being with us anymore. So they really did rely on each other when nobody else had their backs. But there's a woman you probably don't know much about, and she's amazing. Part bodyguard, part drag singer. She's the product of an interracial relationship at a time where that was absolutely illegal. Stormy De La Vie. And it's thought that she might have been the lesbian that was being hauled into the paddy wagon at Stonewall, who incited the Stonewall uprising.
In June of 1969 in New York City, Stormy found herself at the epicenter of the Stonewall riots. If there was a friend in need, Stormy would be there.
That was no riot. Everybody says a riot. It was a disobedience, and then they started fighting back. It was a rebellion. And once they got the hang of it, they rebelled quite well.
Well, many different people say that there was a cross-dressing lesbian who sparked the Stonewall riot, but to the best of my knowledge, no one had ever found someone who fit the description quite as well as she does until I interviewed her, and she said the cop hit me and I hit him back.
I walked away with an eye bleeding, but he was laying on the ground, out.
She says I was there and I did this, but then when I read an account of the cross-dressing lesbian who started the riot, she said, oh, I know who that was, but I'm not going to say.
Well, I got into it by accident. And then Charles Kaiser, when he wrote his book, Gay Metropolis, was trying to figure out how it started. When the fight really started, they were just running around, you know, calling names and things and throwing toilet paper down from the windows and what have you. And I just walked up. I used to come in whenever I came in town to go down to see if anybody needed help or if they were in jail, I could get them out, what I could do. I looked like I was 20, but when that happened, I was 48 years.
48, and she knocked out a cop to protect her own lives and the people around her. Indomitable woman. God, she was amazing. But I digress.
All right, so there were a couple protests that actually kind of paved the way for Stonewall to happen. So one of those was at Julius's. So Julius's is considered to be the oldest gay bar in New York City. Now it's hard to know exactly when it became a gay bar since they worked so much in secret, but it is known to be one of the oldest bars in New York City, period, having started in the early 1800s and being continuous since then. If you guys watch the show Pose, which you absolutely should if you don't, it's in a scene in the first season when Blanca goes into a bar and is turned away because she's transgender. They use the Julius's as that scene. Anyway, so at the time in the 60s, it was considered de facto disorderly conduct if they found out that you were a homosexual. You could be kicked out of the bar, denied service. And since this was happening simultaneously with the civil rights movement, we actually gained a lot of information from the civil rights movement. So one of the popular protests in the civil rights movement was a sit-in. So Black patrons would go into an area that was segregated. They would sit in the white section as kind of a way to be like, look, guys, this is ridiculous. We're not going to stand for this. And so we had our own version. The Mattachine Society, which was an early gay rights organization, held a sip-in. So what they did was they came into the bar, announced that they were homosexuals, and of course were denied service. But this time they had a group of reporters with them. The reporters released the story, and it caused so much commotion that year, the New York State Liquor Authority changed their policy, and you were actually not able to be, according to the law, you were not able to be kicked out of the bar just for being a homosexual, just for being yourself. Now, it was, of course, up to the bar whether they would do it or not, and it still happened very frequently, but at least the law began to change. And it's that protest, that successful protest, that basically birthed the gay bar. It made it so much easier to exist in the gay bar. And it was 3 years prior to Stonewall, so it kind of got that energy going and made Stonewall possible, made that energy of revolution possible.
Yeah. God, they were so cool. But this didn't happen in a vacuum. Like we said with Julius's, the organizations that were setting up the groundwork for Stonewall's success, accidental as it was, because we didn't know what was going to happen, had existed for a very long time in a thriving, though necessarily secretive, community in the Village. And here we have two pictures of McDougal Street in the Village, which was kind of the center of everything up until Stonewall. Slowly, we saw the gay Main Street switch over to Christopher Street in the 60s and 70s, but before that, McDougal was lined with bathhouses and lesbian tea rooms. My favorite being the historic Eve Adams's tea room, which didn't run for very long. Eva Kochever only got a couple of years in the establishment before she was deported for suspected communist ties. and for just general indecency, because she wrote a lot of poetry about her girlfriend, and she was a labor rights activist. Oh no. But she posted a sign in the front of the tea room that said, men are admitted, but not welcome. I'm getting the wording wrong. Basically, you're allowed to come in, but don't expect anything special, because you're not the target audience here. So you could often find people dressing in various codes with specific tie colors, specific handkerchief colors sticking out of their pockets to signal to each other who they were, where they were. And you also Washington Square Park. In fact, Washington Square Park bathrooms used to be a place where police loved to hide out and kind of catfish gay men, convince them to come into the bathroom with them to do whatever they wanted to do, and then book them in there. So it wasn't always a safe place for LGBT people, but it was definitely a central location where everybody could find each other. And it still is today. There's still all sorts of amazing activity going on in there, in terms of just like not the other day, like maybe 2 days before the lockdown in New York, I was walking through there and drag performer Mary Magdalene was voguing her way through in the strappiest thong you've ever seen. If you have never seen her perform, I highly recommend it. She is a wild woman. But it's still very much a hub today, although most of the up and coming, or rather the prominent up and rising, I don't want to say up and coming because that implies class, the gay people in New York who are setting culture and pushing boundaries right now mostly don't live in the Village. Is really expensive. It's really expensive right now, but you can still see echoes of the culture throughout. Now, speaking of places where it is now too expensive for most people in the demographics that made this movement to live, there's a couple of places that I want to tell you guys about. And these actually aren't on our normal tour, because they're in Chelsea, they're in Brooklyn, they're a little all over the place. But in specific, the house all the way on the left, the building there, is the former location of Star House. Now, Star is the organization that Marsha and Sylvia started in order to protect trans youth. Specifically, it stands for Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. And in addition to advocating for trans and gender non-conforming kids who've been kicked out of their homes, they also advocated for sex workers, for LGBT people of color, and they often allied themselves with other groups to create intersectional movements. Like famously, they fought with the Young Lords to advocate for justice for sex workers and for access to education for underserved communities, which was a huge deal at the time, because the American government was not sure what the Young Lords was. We now know it to be a labor rights and education rights activist group, largely focused on communities that are not white, although specifically focused on Puerto Rican communities abroad. But at the time, everybody had their hackles up because a whole bunch of streetwalkers, to use the term they would have used, were hanging out with a whole bunch of Latino kids and causing trouble for, affluent white people, which just goes to show you good things happen when underserved communities cause trouble for affluent white people. Because without Star, we would not be where we are today. Unfortunately, they are no longer where they were then. In fact, because Marsha and Sylvia were both sex workers who were homeless more often than they were not, they couldn't really find an economically and health and safety wise sustainable option for Star House. Before this, they were in a trailer on the waterfront with 20 kids in a tractor trailer, but that got towed by the city. So they were able to get together a little bit of money to rent the building that used to be where that building on the left is now. And Marsha had great hopes of turning the second floor into an education center to catch up all the kids who were no longer going to school because they'd been kicked out of their homes. And while that didn't happen, there are a whole bunch of organizations that took up the banner for STAR and continue that work today, including an extension of STAR that kind of adopted the name and the tenets that's still working today. Now, the house in the middle is very similar. It's a place called Transy House, and it was owned by Rusty Mae Moore and Chelsea Goodwin, who were both trans women as well. And for about 13 years, this ran as a kind of halfway house for kids who didn't have anywhere else to go. So they were able to house about 13 people at a time and keep them off the streets. And one of those people was Sylvia Rivera at the end of her years. It kind of functioned as assisted living for her when she got up there in age. It's an amazing place. And it was founded by two amazing women who also were members of the Metropolitan Gender Network and Transgender Advocacy Coalition, two other non-STAR organizations that were fighting for trans rights, especially the rights of trans people who, you know, don't exactly have my complexion. But the house all the way on the right is the Colonial Inn, which is still functional as a guest house that focuses on LGBT clientele. But back in the day, this is where Mel Cherin lived with Michael Brody. They bought the place for $31,000. Can you imagine buying real estate in Chelsea for only $31,000?
Oh my God, you get laughed out of the place.
Right? But they did. They bought this house. They were very lucky. They were able to get it together. And shortly after the purchase is when the AIDS epidemic hit. And right when that happened, New York started getting active in advocacy for people with HIV. And Mel Cherin offered up what we now know as the Colonial Inn house, first one floor, then 2 floors of the place, as the headquarters for the burgeoning gay men's health crisis at GMHC. So this is the birthplace of AIDS activism. And that's so cool. You can still sleep there today once phase 4 hits and we have accommodations open again in New York City. So yeah, really cool.
Okay, guys. So another important meeting place were churches, which are typically not a very welcome place for the members of the LGBT community. But the church on the left was one example of one that was welcoming. So this is the Washington Square United Methodist Church. So from the years 1973 to 1984, Paul M. Abels was the pastor, and he came out in 1977, making him the first gay man, openly out gay man of a major Christian denomination. And so during his time, he made this a very safe place for the LGBT community. It was the meeting place for so many different organizations. It was where the Gay Men's Chorus had their first rehearsal in 1979. And just so much stuff. Paul would have covenant ceremonies. So since you couldn't get married at the time, he would have these little ceremonies joining people together in front of God. One important thing he would do is he would give last rites for people who had died of HIV and AIDS, which was not happening. A lot of churches wouldn't administer that to people who have died of AIDS because at those times there was so much misinformation. So he spent a lot of his time at St. Vincent's, which is just around the corner from where this church was. So now, unfortunately, this church, they sold it in 2004. So it is no longer an operating church. It is now apartment buildings, it is condos, which I can only imagine how gorgeous, especially that room behind the stained glass. Much of the building has been maintained. The exterior of the building has been maintained, but the interior is obviously now apartments. So it's unfortunate that they weren't able to stick around, but we still have that history of a safe place among the church where people could come and congregate.
Also, if you were wondering about just how much the village has gentrified since Stonewall, this place used to be the place where people who had nothing left got their last rites done. And now the only part of the exterior that's been noticeably changed is it no longer has doorknobs. you put your thumb on a little scan pad on the side of the door, and when it recognizes your thumbprint, the doors roll open. That's the kind of money that lives in the village right now.
Yeah. If that's not gentrification, I don't know what is.
Ugh. But there's nice dogs that live there, so it's okay. But the church on the right is a church that is still active within the community. It's Judson Memorial Church. It's just off of Washington Square Park, and it's extremely active in the LGBT community. It was one of the first churches in the city to march in the Pride Parade, partially because of the influence of Reverend Al Carmines. So Al Carmines is a really big deal, both within the church and also in the world of New York City theater, because he pioneered the idea of off-Broadway theater, where you have a very intimate space, 99 people in the theater or less, and you get to do really wild things. There's stories from these reviews about Al putting people on stage completely naked, covered in raw fish and sausages. And strange guttural screaming. Like, he was really pushing the boundaries of what theater could be. He was writing operettas about Abraham Lincoln and Gertrude Stein. He was incredible. So he was pushing the boundaries of art, pushing the boundaries of religion, and making his church a more accepting place for everybody. Now, unfortunately, we lost Al to HIV in 2005, I believe. But the church still carries on his legacy. They are always one of the first religious institutions in the lineup for the Pride Parade when we are lucky enough that we're not in a pandemic and we can have one. They regularly run services that take care of people on important days, like on the weekend of World AIDS Day, on Pride weekend. They're always making sure to keep that in focus. They've been known to offer special homilies that acknowledge the people whose fathers don't necessarily agree with their idea of masculinity for gay men and trans women on Father's Day. Like, they're amazing. They take really good care of people. And I have several friends who lost their faith when they were kicked out of their own church communities, who have since, and all of them have gone to NYU because it's right next door to this thing. But all of these NYU students who decided they were never going to go to church again because God didn't love them, they found Judson. And they found a religious community that not only accepted them, but embraced them. So if you're ever in New York and you want to hit them up, if you're looking for a religious service that's also extremely inclusive, I highly recommend them. I believe they're also doing virtual services right now if anyone wants to attend. They're really cool. I don't go to church myself, but if I did, I'd go there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so next up, we've got one spot. So on the left, we have the Duplex, which is the oldest running, continuously running cabaret space in New York City. And if you have any fans of Will and Grace, you will actually, you'll recognize the name. You won't recognize the actual place in it. They use a soundstage in LA, which also is much bigger than the Duplex actually is. So you would not recognize it at all. But that is where Just Jack happened. So it made the Duplex famous, well, at least on television. And one of the important things about Will and Grace was that was one of the first shows on television to have representation for the LGBT community. And I remember as a kid watching the show, and it was some of the first gay people I had ever met. I think it's so important to be able to see yourself in media, to be able to know that there are other people like you, that your lifestyle is warranted and is welcome and accepted. Now we are so lucky to have so many amazing shows that show so many different kinds of people in the LGBT plus community. But Will and Grace was one of the first. And so the Duplex, you can still go. They do, hopefully, when things open up again, they have shows, they have so many cabarets. So a lot of famous people got their start there. Woody Allen, Barbra Streisand had a performance there. So a lot of people, it is the stepping stone for Broadway performances. So you can catch them before they become famous, before they make it big. So another important area, an important cultural spot in the West Village is the IFC Theater. Now, this picture is from the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So that premiered in the US at this theater in 1973. And they've been doing midnight performances since then. So the Rocky Horror Picture Show, if you haven't seen it, which get it together if you haven't, it's amazing to think about that show in the 70s. It is this movie that puts bisexuality in front and center. It puts being a transsexual front and center. And it's very irreverent, it's very silly, but I think that was part of what made it more palatable for people. The show was fun and campy and over the top. And so for the first time, people were essentially meeting characters who were of gender expressions that they'd never heard of or experienced before. And the movie is this celebration of sexual liberation, of identity, of acceptance. And incredible to think about what else was happening in the 70s. Like it was so far ahead of its time, and it premiered at that theater. You can still, and then it spread across the country. It became a cult classic. People would go and have these midnight performances, and it gained a life of its own. If you've ever done a midnight performance of Rocky Horror, they have a shadow cast performing in front of the stage. There have been people that have seen the show so many times that there's literally a dialogue with the movie. There is a full-on script that everyone seems to know. And I think people were ready for it. They were ready for a movie that celebrated the counterculture. It celebrated people who hadn't been celebrated before, who hadn't been able to see themselves in media before. And I think it's one of the reasons why it gained such a life after its theatrical release.
Yeah, and to add a little something in there, I actually, Glenn, you don't know this yet. I recently wrote a piece for a small-time media publication about Rocky Horror and how it could only have happened in the Village.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because it really could have. It really, because it started out as a play. And the play was a smash hit in England, and then it came to Broadway, and oh my God, I know only one person who liked it. And he's the guy who commissioned the op-ed from me. He is the only one. It closed so quickly. Nobody was ready for it. And then it got turned into a movie by the same guy, Richard O'Brien, who wrote the original. And the movie did so poorly in all but one of its 8 starting locations that it never actually opened in New York on its premiere schedule. They pulled it from the Halloween premiere because they just thought New York wouldn't show up. They wanted to cut their losses. It ran as a double feature with a whole bunch of like other campy, horror-y, sci-fi-ish things, and that didn't do too well either, even on college campuses. It was only when the Waverly picked it up, now the IFC Center, that the people in the Village saw themselves in the film and went back to see it so often they memorized it, and now it's a cult classic, and that could only have happened in this community. So that's the reason why you know what to say when you hear somebody say anticipation. It's all right there. It's so cool. And this is also a theater that is very much focused on telling these stories. To this day, they when they reopened, of course, and before they closed for the pandemic, they focus on the voices of those marginalized in society, the people who were always gravitating towards the Village. So this was a great premiere location for queer filmmakers in the 80s and 90s. A whole bunch of my uncle's stuff is played here. Actually, they did a 20-year retrospective in 2014 where we got to talk to the producers on Postcards from America about that team, about all the work that they did together, and about where that film sat in the canon of queer cinema. So the staff there at this indie film house are very committed to upholding the legacy that made Rocky Horror a thing in the first place, which is so cool. So cool. But speaking of the people of the village who made that possible, this is just a small collection of the amazing LGBT voices that have been a part of the village in its making. And some of them date further than the village. And for example, Murray Hall, all the way on the left. Now, while he was alive, everybody was like, oh, this is just some scummy Politico. But we like him. He's personable. He's good at billiards. His wife's nice. The coroner who did his autopsy discovered something unexpected, though. Knowing Murray Hall as a man for his whole adult life, he found some slightly different anatomy underneath. And now we know that Murray Hall is one of the earliest confirmed transgender people in New York City politics. He was not a good person by our moral standards. He worked a lot with Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall were, the people who fought for the rights of immigrants in New York, but they're also the people who started the race riots, the draft riot of 1863. So I don't know about that morality. But I think there is something beautiful to be said that in one of the oldest professions, politics, there is queer representation, good, bad, otherwise. I'm here for it. I think that it's fantastic that somebody of the community, of the rainbow family, can be just as scummy as all of his neighbors and be completely accepted without question as who he is. Also, we have later figured out that he also went by the name John Anderson in his home country of Scotland and left behind a wife there. So he's technically a bigamist too. But I say that not to condemn him. Like, baller, man. His wife in Scotland said, okay, either you calm down with all the cheating on me or I tell everybody about your dirty little secret. And he moved to America instead. And we didn't learn about his secret until he passed. So that is a strange kind of success story of its era. But we're talking like 1850s and 60s. He passed in the year 1900. And him being outed after his death is what led to the field of sexology being created in the first place. A scientist by the name of Havelock Ellis started studying gender nonconformity based on Murray Hall's autopsy and life story as a case study, and opened up this massive library of studies in Berlin in order to learn more about what gender nonconformity really was. And he came to a lot of the conclusions we're coming to now. So why don't we still have that? Well, that library was in Berlin in the 1930s, and so were the Nazis. So unfortunately, none of that scholarship still survives. We only have record that it existed. But we wouldn't have any of this if it wasn't for Murray Hall. Next to him is Samuel Clemens, although you know him better as Mark Twain. He lived on 10th Street, just north of Washington Square Park. And there is a lot of debate as to whether or not he's, in the Rainbow Fam. But if you read some of his letters from when he was in his Western phase to his friends, they're not just friends. They're not just friends. And I think that this speaks to our ability to camouflage as a community, that no one really knew outside of the people he was comfortable knowing whether he was into men or not. And that now it's mostly speculation, although I think the facts are there enough to say, yeah, he counts as a gay icon of the village. And next to him is Eleanor Roosevelt. She's amazing, and so is her girlfriend, Lorraine Hickok. They lived on the corner of Washington Square Park, overlooking the park, in an apartment that FDR and Eleanor bought to get away from his mother. And when FDR died, Eleanor moved in there full time with her longtime girlfriend, Lorena Hickok. She and FDR had a bit of an arrangement, so they each had a mistress. And Lorena was a very prominent, mover and shaker in her own right as a very active journalist. So the two of them, for the rest of their lives, lived in that apartment with Eleanor working on her humanitarian work and Lorena writing and advancing the causes of humanitarian aid, civil rights, and in their own quiet way, the gay rights movement as well. Just around the corner from them was Lorraine Hansberry. who is famous for being the first Black woman to have a play produced on Broadway. But what most people don't know is that she took all of her Broadway earnings and she bought a house, a brick, 5-story house in the middle of the village. And she rented out a whole bunch of the floors because she didn't need all of that space. She was at the time separated from her white Jewish husband. So she's already flouting anti-miscegenation laws at this point. So she's already pushing boundaries. And she's separated from her husband, and she meets her tenant on the 5th floor, a lovely little woman named Dorothy. And they strike up a relationship for 5 years until Lorraine passes away from cancer. The two of them were members of the Daughters of Bilitis together, now defunct lesbian activist society. They were both members of various sub-organizations that collaborated with the NAACP. They were very, very active in the community as well. And though Lorraine was not alive to see Stonewall, I'm sure she would have been proud. And Dorothy was as well. So she's kind of incredible. Next to her, another amazing woman with a cute girlfriend who moved and shaked, Edie Windsor, who passed away only very recently. We were very lucky to have her for as long as we did, because when her wife passed away, she was told that she had to pay an exorbitant estate tax on that. Now, she was a very well-experienced activist at the time, having worked in various activist societies before this. So she knew exactly what to do. She got her lawyers and she got Dianne Feinstein on her on the phone, and she sued for the right to a spousal unlimited deduction on those taxes, something that heterosexual couples across the country had the right to. And she fought this all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court deciding that as the wife of her wife, she was entitled to that spousal deduction. That's what struck down the Defense of Marriage Act and made gay marriage legally recognized across the country, giving same-sex couples the same spousal rights as all of the heterosexual couples around them in the eyes of federal law. So she's kind of a big deal. And she happened to live in the same building as another man who's very important to our story. Glenn, could you take it away?
Yes. Yeah, so we have Larry Kramer, who actually just passed away this year. So it's even more poignant to be talking about him at the moment. So he's an interesting character. He has an interesting place within the gay community because throughout much of his career, he produced things that kind of shook up the gay community. The first book that he published was a book called Faggots, which essentially was based on his life. And it was a story that basically implied that the amount of sex that gay men are having is preventing them from finding love. So this is before the AIDS epidemic that he produced this novel. So he's not a very popular person in the gay community. We have finally had this sexual revolution after Stonewall. People are coming out more, and we're able to kind of be in the limelight a bit more. And he's basically saying, hey, this sexual revolution that you're finding is dangerous and preventing you from finding love. So he was not very well liked within the community. But when the AIDS epidemic hit, he was one of the only ones who was willing to stand up and kind of shake things up a bit. So that leads us to his activism within the Gay Men's Health Crisis and ACT UP. So the Gay Men's Health Crisis was an organization just with a few of his friends that literally started in his apartment. They had the first meeting in 1981. They raised about just over $6,000 for AIDS research. Now, what was difficult within the organization was there was sort of two camps. There was Larry Kramer, who thought that the way to make change was to get angry, was to rile people up, was to get people impassioned. Whereas the other half thought that the way to get change was through honey rather than vinegar. This was also the group of people that were in the closet. It was hard to have an organization where, if you were out, you could potentially lose your job. So some of the leaders of the Gay Men's Health Crisis were still in the closet. And those tended to be the people that wanted to be a little bit nicer, a little bit more more amicable with what's the word I'm thinking of? With the public health, with lawmakers. What am I thinking of?
Yeah.
So anyway, this came to a head in 1983 when finally, after years of trying to get a meeting with the mayor, who had been utterly silent about the AIDS epidemic, the gay men's health crisis, gets a meeting with the mayor. So Larry's so excited. This organization that he started in his living room, he's finally going to get to say all the shit he's been wanting to say to the mayor. And the rest of the organization says, hey, sorry, Larry, you're not invited. Fuck that shit. I'm out, he says. And that year he left the organization and started his own organization, ACT UP, or the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Now, this is sort of a grassroots organization. It was entirely in the way that he wanted it to be. So it was protests that were angry, in your face. So their first protest is the photo that's on the bottom right-hand corner. That was at St. Patrick's Cathedral. It was during a church service. They ran through the aisles shouting, "They're killing us. Your silence is killing us." And they literally dropped down in the midst of these pews as if they were dead and dying, talking about how the Catholic Church and their stance on gay people was literally killing us. Their silence, the lack of action against the AIDS epidemic was killing people. So this photo is taken just outside during that protest. So that was much more aligned with his views on how he thought a protest should be run. So he wasn't always the most popular person within the community, but we still think of him as one of the most vocal. So he eventually turned his story into a play called The Normal Heart, which was then eventually turned into a movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It is gut-wrenching, but it's a really amazing, intimate look as to what it was like to, in that time, early organizers, early activists. So the spirit of Larry is still with us, fighting for those who don't have a voice.
Yeah, and both of these organizations are still active. GMHC runs the AIDS Walk every year, or not this year, but in normal years where it's safe to be outside in crowds. And ACT UP is still very active today, and they have a better relationship with each other than they used to, but they typically still stick to the same tactics. ACT UP is still very much in your face. They're very careful about releasing information about what they're doing before they do it, in order to make sure that their activists are safe while causing as much of a ruckus as possible. Whereas GMHC, much more, I'm gonna say family friendly, I guess. They don't get in your face. They're very much trying to win people over. Both of them have their place still, is what I'm trying to say, in the community. Both of them are very much still necessary to getting the job done. And part of the reason why it was so important to get the job done is because New York City was a major epicenter for the AIDS epidemic. And the shots that you're seeing right now are outside of the former St. Vincent's Hospital, which is now condos because nothing is sacred in this city. And a shot of from a newspaper of a nurse. Actually, I don't know if this is a nurse or if this is a volunteer, and a doctor taking care of an AIDS patient with sarcoma in hospice, in his last days. St. Vincent's was the only hospital on the East Coast for quite some time to admit AIDS patients. In The Normal Heart, there's this monologue that makes me cry every single time, where one of our characters describes having to transport a loved one's body in a trash bag, and what happened when he wasn't allowed into the hospital, literally left on the steps to die there. But St. Vincent's didn't do that. St. Vincent's was a Sisters of Charity hospital, and there were a whole bunch of free or low-cost clinics in Lower Manhattan, in the East and West villages, and a little bit south, that provided that care to anybody who needed it. A couple blocks over, that included Edgar Allan Poe in the 1830s, along with his cousin / wife. That was weird. But both of them were treated for consumption there. And the AIDS epidemic was no different. They did not care that everybody else was turning these people out. They felt like that was not a reason to do so themselves. And as a result, we kind of became a health destination for anybody who could afford it. So people were coming from wherever they could, if they could, to get treated in this hospital. And it unfortunately closed due to lack of funding in 2010. But before that, they were the ones who kept my uncle alive. They treated him when nobody else would touch him. And, you know, my uncle was diagnosed before I was born, and I was 13 when he passed. So we got a lot more time with him than we might have if people like St. Vincent's hadn't stepped up to the plate. And to this day, we're never really sure how many of the tenants know what happened in St. Vincent's, but the last time I said that out loud in front of St. Vincent's to a group of guests, a guy in a suit who was walking into the building goes, "Yeah, I do. I talk about it with my son." I never saw him again, but it made my heart glow. Other notable instances of St. Vincent's stepping up to the plate, they were the ones who took care of the injured from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in the early 1900s. They were the ones who took in all of the survivors from the Titanic. And they're also the hospital that took in all of the survivors and the wounded from 9/11. So they're kind of a big deal. And the AIDS epidemic was really their greatest moment to shine through that darkness. Now, speaking of the AIDS epidemic and hotspots, the hardest hit neighborhood is actually a little bit north of the West Village, the neighborhood of Chelsea. They, as a neighborhood, sustained more casualties to the AIDS epidemic than anywhere else. And part of that is because there was a huge gay population living there who were regularly socializing in the village. So they would take everything that was contracted everywhere else home with them. And there were also a whole lot of gay bars in the neighborhood that were known for their excessive debauchery. We'll put it that way, because I know there might be children watching this on Facebook. But the two most famous clubs in Chelsea were the Anvil and Mine Shaft. Now, the Anvil was founded out of an hourly hotel, which shows you what kind of vibe we were going for there, but it was also very popular amongst famous people who wanted to slum it, like Jackie Onassis's sister, who now she was royalty at that point. She had married a prince or a count. It doesn't really matter, because the important thing here is she would show up half naked on the tables dancing at the Anvil at 2 a.m. And Truman Capote was spotted here on a number of different occasions. The Anvil no longer exists. It actually closed itself down during the epidemic so as not to have their clientele be inordinately affected by the epidemic due to their operations. The Mine Shaft, on the other hand, was closed down by the Department of Health and Safety. You can actually see in the bottom middle picture, these are the cops that were closing down the club for good. And the picture above that is the logo for the Mine Shaft. Now, if you recognize some of that iconography, then you're a fan of the band Queen. Freddie Mercury has been known to wear a shirt with the Mine Shaft logo on it in music videos and performances. But you might also recognize them from a little band called the Village People, who took their costumes from the dress code for the Mine Shaft. You were allowed to show up wearing anything so long as there was no perfume, no cologne, and no fancy dress, no like suits. But you could show up looking like a construction worker. You could show up looking like a cowboy, and it was fine. And that is how the Village People started. And nowadays we think of the Village People as being relatively family-friendly fun, singing about, you know, workout facilities and branches of our military. But similarly, the Mine Shaft is now a very family-friendly place. It's one of the locations for the sugar factory. So you can go to where there used to be a giant tub of Crisco, and I'll leave it to your imagination as to what was being done with it. You could go to where there used to be a giant tub of Crisco, and you can sit your kids down and have a cotton candy milkshake.
Mm.
So gentrification as well, but honestly, I'm gonna have to go with the sugar factory on this one. The stories that have come out of the mine shaft, it just isn't quite my scene. But another major hotspot of the epidemic was Manhattan Plaza, which is in Hell's Kitchen. It was originally opened in 1977 as affordable housing for actors in a measure to try to beautify and push out crime from the Times Square Hell's Kitchen area. The big joke back in the day was that they call it 42nd Street because you got 40 seconds before you get mugged. And the city was very much trying to reform its image, and they knew that if the actors who made their money on Broadway would then spend their money on Broadway, that would encourage more grocery stores to open up and more laundromats to open up where there used to be, crack houses and brothels. And that's exactly what happened. As artists started moving into this building, we suddenly had graffiti show up, that kind of thing. And now you can find a laundromat where there used to be a crack house. It's incredible. But because this is a community that was populated almost entirely by artists, and because the arts has always been a haven for those whose self-expression has been frowned upon elsewhere, this intersection of the arts community and the LGBT community made this ground zero of the AIDS epidemic. Proportionally, more people died of AIDS and AIDS-related complications in this building than anywhere else in the country. In 6 years, from 1983 to 1986, there are 75 people that died in this building that we know about. And with AIDS being as stigmatized as it was, it's safe to say it's only a small percentage of the people who passed away in the building. One of those people in the building was a Mr. Pippins. And I know this because the woman on the left is Nita Pippins, his mom. Now, she was one of those rare angelic mothers of AIDS patients at the time who stepped up to the plate. I can thankfully count my grandma amongst those women as well. And Grandma, if you're not watching this now, I know you will be later. Hi. But Nita Pippins moved in with her son to take care of him as his health was declining. And when he died, she kept his apartment. And she served as a kind of ambassador for all of the other parents who were doing the same thing. She ran a kind of support group for parents who were coming in from out of town to take care of their children who were dying from HIV complications and AIDS. And she also acted as a surrogate mother for people whose parents did not show up. She was really an angel, and she passed away at a very old age, having lived a very long and fulfilling life in the Manhattan Plaza in her son's old apartment. And this picture is actually from her obituary in the New York Times. She was so important to this community, she got a Times obit. She is my idol. She and Lorraine Hansberry, honestly, if they could be my second and third mom, I'd be very happy.
Okay, so now we've got the waterfront. So on the very far left, so some of the old warehouses, that is known to be the very first meeting place for Star before they were eventually kicked out. The organization that Marsha P Johnson and Sylvia Rivera started to house homeless trans youth. And they had quite a few homes in their history because it was difficult for them to maintain one. They were always being kicked out or moved on, but this is known to be the very first location. In the center here, we have Christopher Street Pier, which is a place that I have frequented many times in my time in New York City. It is sort of a great meeting place now. It's been a meeting place since its inception, and it's still to this day is a place where you can congregate, you can hang out. It's a great place to go on a beautiful day. And a few years ago, this is where Sarah and I attended a Pride event. So we can see that in this next video right here.
watching it again. So for a little bit of context here, we were actually studying up to give this tour for the first time, Glenn and I. And it just so happened that we were doing so at the same time as a memorial rally for Gilbert Baker, who created the first ever Pride flag. And the original Pride flag had a fair number more colors than the one that we were lifting right there. For example, it started with pink, something that we don't really see around anymore because of manufacturing issues and things like that. But Gilbert Baker had just passed away when this had happened. And there was a big rally on Christopher Street with his flag behind him, with all sorts of speakers, one speaker for every color on the original flag. And it just so happened that they were wrapping up purple when we came back from our walkthrough. So we grabbed a quick beer, and then we got back out there and discovered that they needed people to carry Gilbert's original banners when he first made them in California. So there were rows of us, and Glenn and I had the immense honor and pleasure of being able to help carry one of those banners down Christopher Street to the waterfront, where they were collected up, and that flag was flown over the Hudson River for the first time ever. And that had always been a dream of Gilbert's. So it was really a wonderful moment. And I cannot wait until the day where finally, someday, I know it's going to happen, that becomes a permanent installation on the waterfront.
Yeah.
So cool.
So now another feature of the waterfront, so on the left, this is actually the first official AIDS memorial. So it's a little plaque that reads, I can sail without wind, I can row without oars, but I cannot pass, I cannot part from my friends without tears. Now what's beautiful about this, this memorial is it's essentially a little bench you can come to. And those who are living with HIV and AIDS, it takes such a toll on your body that this memorial not only memorializes those you've lost, but it's also a quiet place to sit if you are still living with HIV and AIDS. It was originally conceived in 1994, wasn't created until 2008, but was the first official AIDS memorial. And it stands on the waterfront in quite a good spot because this was originally an area where there was a lot of cruising going on. So it was sort of an epicenter for those living with HIV and AIDS. And it's now a cute little spot you can sit along the waterfront, very close to Christopher Street Pier.
Yeah. And the next big memorial that was opened in New York City about 8 years later on World AIDS Day 2016 is on the site of St. Vincent's Hospital. Now, most of it has been turned into condos, but one particular building has been closed down and turned into a park, and that's what you see on the right. The trees behind it have some lovely benches. There's a water feature that kids can play in just behind this. But this white triangular structure here is the AIDS Memorial of St. Vincent's. And all of these triangles here are very similar to ACT UP's symbology. It's reclaiming this symbol that the Nazis used to oppress gay people, that triangle that they had, and turning it on its head and using it as a symbol for healing and justice, which I think is really cool. It also provides like intermittent shade over these nice benches, which once again is a fantastic thing for a community where one of the hallmarks of the affected community is loss of respiratory function and capacity to internalize and retain energy. There's also that cute little circle in the middle is a fountain that pours over very gently to help you reflect on what's happening. And all around the fountain are the words of Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. And now I'm not sure if Walt Whitman was gay or not. I don't think anybody really knows, but his words became tremendously important to the gay community in New York City, especially the activist community, to the point where his we read a segment of his Leaves of Grass at my uncle's memorial, actually. So this was something that resonated very deeply with the community. Every single bit of it is layered with meaning, and it is a truly wonderful, restful, peaceful, and in some ways joyful place to come and reflect on where we've been and the strides that were made by those who we lost to get us to where we are today. Because today, in the Western world, in the United States, AIDS is not a death sentence. And the people who championed the cause to make that a priority are the people that we memorialize in this park, including now Larry Kramer, who, fun fact, was one-time bitter rival to, and by the end of his life, very close friends with Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is currently our champion and our voice of reason on the coronavirus pandemic, but who became famous at first working with the CDC on AIDS research. And Larry was the one who pushed him to get on everybody's butts about that when the White House did not want to prioritize AIDS research. So it was that early antagonism that led Larry and Tony to a very productive friendship that gave us the health advancements that we have today, so that my friends who are positive are going to be around when we're all in the nursing home. And it's a weird time to be alive right now. And it was a weird time alive to be alive back then. And I think that it's important that we reflect on the joy that can be found, as well as reflecting on what we've lost and the importance of keeping what we have. But speaking of which.
So now we have the Gay Liberation Monument. So this stands right outside of Stonewall. So what I think is interesting about the statue was, so it is two men embracing and then two women. And this apparently was too much for New York City when it was first installed. It was installed for the 10-year anniversary of Stonewall, 1979. So it was actually returned to the artist's residence in, remind me where it was?
Wisconsin.
Madison, Wisconsin. Of all places, that was where it was acceptable. And then finally, after 10 years again, it was returned to its rightful place. So this monument is a cool place to kind of reflect on how far we've come. What's incredible about, what I think is so wonderful about this movement is, in such a short time, we've come so far. In just 50 years, we went from police brutality, literally being kicked out of bars, being arrested for public displays of affection, to, in 2016, President Obama made the Stonewall Inn a national monument, making it the first LGBT national monument. So it's just a testament to the tenacity of this community, to how much they have worked to get us where we are right now, how far we've come in such a short amount of time. And it kind of reminds us of how much we still have to do, the work that we still have to do to make sure that everyone within the LGBT plus community deserves the same rights. Right now, our fight is for our trans women of color, for access to healthcare, especially for people living with HIV and AIDS. So we still have a long way to go, but it's a reminder of how far we've come in such a short amount of time.
Yeah. It's also the end of our virtual tour, friends. I know that Glenn will also want to say this, but I want to start off by saying thank you so much for joining us, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube or on this Zoom call. It was an absolute pleasure to be able to trot this tour out with you again this year. If you liked it, I encourage you to go to the link that's displayed on the screen, exp1.com/tips. That'll bring you to a tipping page where if you feel like donating, you can do so, and under guide name, just say Stonewall, or you can list me or Glenn. And no matter what, that money is going to be going to the Stonewall Gives Back initiative, an amazing organization that champions the right to safety and housing and education for LGBT youth who've been kicked out of their homes. They're a tremendous resource. So yeah, if you feel like that's a cause that you want to support now that you know more about it, I highly recommend that you jump over there and go to that link and throw a little love towards Stonewall.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us. I think it's so important every year to remember, it's easy to get lost in the parties and the celebrations, in the rainbows, and it's easy to lose sight of what started these celebrations, which at its core was a fight against police brutality. It was a fight to stand up for who you are and what you believe in. And as much as this pride doesn't look like prides in the past have, I think it's actually, we're kind of returning to our roots. The fight for the Black Lives Matter movement, the fight for our Black trans sisters who are dying at an extraordinary rate. I think that is the most authentic pride we've had since the original one.
Oh God, yeah.
So there actually is a rally today in New York City. They're turning it into a march. So it may not be a parade, but I think it is the most authentic pride we've had in a long time. So I'm gonna check that out online. I hope you guys all do the same. But yeah, thank you for joining us, for keeping the story alive. And it was a pleasure to share that history with you guys.
Yeah. And if there's anything here that you want to know more about, I can tag both of us in the comment section of our Facebook video. You can always go back to the Facebook video and rewatch to dig a little bit deeper into the various topics that we talked about today. And I highly encourage everybody to do a little bit of deeper digging. We were only able to scratch the surface of New York City queer history on this, hour and 15-minute journey that we had together. There is so much more. So I highly encourage you to take that adventure and to let me know when you do, let both of us know when you do, so we can come along with you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you guys. Happy Pride.